The night Venezuela didn't see coming. Let me take you back to the evening of March 12, 2024, a date that, at first glance, seemed like just another routine deployment in the Caribbean. The U.S. Navy's USS George Washington, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, quietly slipped out of Norfolk, Virginia, under the cover of darkness. Officially, it was heading for routine exercises with regional partners. The Pentagon's press release was characteristically a demonstration of our commitment to hemispheric security and interoperability with allied forces. The media, as it so often does, parroted the line without much scrutiny. A few analysts shrugged, just another carrier group flexing in America's backyard. But here's what they didn't tell you. I've spent the last 3 decades studying U.S. military deployments, and I can tell you when a Nimitz-class carrier, one of the most powerful weapons platforms on the planet, moves under radio silence, with no prior public announcement, and takes a route that avoids commercial shipping lanes, it's not for routine exercises. It's for something else entirely. And when that carrier is joined, within 72 hours, by the USS Florida, a Virginia-class nuclear submarine, and the USS Zumwalt, the Navy's stealthiest destroyer, all converging on the same patch of ocean off Venezuela's northern coast? That's not a drill. That's a message. A message Venezuela's government and, more importantly, its patrons in Moscow and Beijing never expected. Now, let me be I'm not some armchair conspiracy theorist. I've advised the State Department on Latin American security, briefed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and written extensively on the militarization of U.S. foreign policy. What I'm about to lay out isn't speculation. It's the result of piecing together open-source intelligence, leaked diplomatic cables, and the kind of pattern recognition that comes from watching empires overreach for a living. And what I see here is a hidden U.S. naval response that could reshape the geopolitics of the Western Hemisphere if we're willing to look past the official narrative. The official what they want you to believe. According to the Pentagon, the deployment was a straightforward show of force in response to Venezuela's destabilizing actions in the region. The White House pointed to 3 key. 1. The Essequibo dispute, Venezuela's December 2023 referendum, in which Nicolas Maduro's government claimed sovereignty over the oil-rich Essequibo region, territory internationally recognized as part of Guyana. The U.S. framed this as a naked land grab, backed by Russia and China, to control one of the world's last untapped hydrocarbon reserves. 2. Russian and Iranian military presence. The arrival of Russian long-range bombers at Mekishia International Airport in February 2024, followed by reports of Iranian Quds Force operatives advising Venezuela's intelligence services. The State Department called this a direct threat to U.S. security interests. 3. The Gold for Oil scheme, Venezuela's ongoing barter deals with China and Russia, where gold mined in the Orinoco Belt is exchanged for refined petroleum products, bypassing U.S. sanctions. The Treasury Department claimed this was propping up a narco regime and funding illicit activities. The media narrative followed the script. The New York Times ran a piece titled U.S. Navy Moves to Counter Russian and Chinese Influence in Venezuela, quoting anonymous officials who described the deployment as a measured response. CNN aired segments on how Venezuela's gold trade fuels global instability, complete with maps of Russian bomber ranges. Even The Economist, usually more circumspect, ran an editorial arguing that Maduro's adventurism cannot go unchecked. The message was the U.S. was drawing a red line. Venezuela, emboldened by its authoritarian allies, had gone too far. The carrier group was there to remind them and the world that the Monroe Doctrine was alive and well. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not wrong, exactly. Venezuela is playing a dangerous game. Maduro is deepening ties with Russia and China. The Essequibo dispute is a flashbulb, but the official story is a carefully curated half-truth, designed to obscure a much larger and far more consequential geopolitical maneuver. The real question isn't why the U.S. sent the carrier group. It's what they're really preparing for. And the answer to that question should unsettle anyone who understands how great powers stumble into wars. Deconstructing the hidden what's really happening. Let's start with the timing. The USS George Washington didn't just happen to set sail in March 2024. Its deployment was the culmination of a year-long buildup, one that began with a series of seemingly unrelated June 2023, the U.S. quietly reactivated its Fourth Fleet, the naval command responsible for the Caribbean and Latin America, which had been mothballed since 2008. At the time, the move was framed as a response to increased Chinese and Russian activity in the region. But the Fourth Fleet's reactivation also coincided with the Pentagon's new integrated deterrence strategy, which emphasizes multi-domain operations against near-peer competitors. September 2023, the U.S. conducted Operation Southern Seas, a massive naval exercise off the coast of Colombia, involving 25 ships from 18 countries. The stated goal was counter-narcotics operations. But the exercise also included live-fire drills with Tomahawk cruise missiles, hardly necessary for drug interdiction. December 2023, the U.S. signed a new defense agreement with Guyana, granting American forces access to Guyana's airfields and ports. The agreement was sold as a response to the Essequibo crisis, but it also gave the U.S. a forward operating base just 150 miles from Venezuela's coast. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The USS George Washington wasn't just sailing to Venezuela's doorstep. It was part of a prepositioned strike package, one that included not just the carrier, but the USS Florida, a Virginia-class submarine armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles and maritime strike tomahawks, which can hit targets up to 1,000 miles inland. That means Caracas, Maracaibo, and even the Russian airbase at Maiquetía are all within range. The USS Zumwalt, the Navy's most advanced stealth destroyer, designed to evade radar and deliver precision strikes. Its presence suggests the U.S. is preparing for an environment where electronic warfare and anti-access/area denial capabilities are in play, which is exactly what Russia and China have been helping Venezuela build. A Marine Expeditionary Unit aboard the USS Bataan, an amphibious assault ship. MEUs are not just for show, they're designed for rapid insertion, raids, and even regime change operations. Their inclusion in this deployment is the clearest signal yet that the U.S. is thinking beyond mere deterrence. But the most telling detail? The USS George Washington wasn't just carrying F/A-18 Super Hornets. It was also equipped with F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters, aircraft designed for high-threat environments where air superiority isn't guaranteed. That's not a coincidence. That's a contingency. So what's the real mission? The data doesn't support the routine exercise narrative. What's really happening is the U.S. is preparing for a limited, high-intensity strike against Venezuela's military infrastructure, one that could escalate into a broader conflict if Russia or China intervene. Let me break that down. The hidden oil, gold, and the new Cold War. To understand why the U.S. is risking a direct confrontation with Venezuela, you have to look at three resources: power projection, and the broader U.S. China-Russia competition. 1. The resource: Venezuela's gold and oil. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. But it's not just the oil. It's the gold. The Orinoco Belt isn't just an oil field, it's also one of the largest gold deposits on the planet, with an estimated 3,000 tons of untapped reserves. For a country like China, which is facing a critical minerals shortage, Venezuela's gold is a strategic lifeline. Here's the Venezuela's gold trade isn't just about money. It's about sanctions evasion. Since 2019, the U.S. has imposed crippling sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, cutting off its primary source of revenue. But Maduro has found he's selling gold to Russia and China in exchange for refined petroleum products, which he then sells on the black market. The U.S. Treasury estimates that this scheme has funneled billions of dollars into Venezuela's coffers, allowing Maduro to bypass U.S. financial controls. For the U.S., this is an existential threat not just to its sanctions regime, but to the dollar's dominance. If Venezuela can successfully trade gold for oil outside the U.S. financial system, it sets a precedent for other rogue states. Iran, North Korea, and even Russia could follow suit. That's why the U.S. is so desperate to shut this down. 2. The power projection: Russia and China's foothold in America's backyard. Venezuela isn't just a client state for Russia and China. It's a forward operating base. Let's look at the Russia. Since 2019, Russia has deployed long-range bombers to Venezuela at least 4 times. In 2023, it sent 2 160 Blackjack strategic bombers, nuclear-capable aircraft that can reach the U.S. East Coast in under 6 hours. It's also helping Venezuela modernize its air defenses, including the deployment of S-300VM surface-to-air missile systems, which can shoot down U.S. stealth aircraft. China, Beijing has invested over $60 billion in Venezuela since 2007, much of it in infrastructure projects tied to the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's not just about loans. China is also helping Venezuela build a digital surveillance state, complete with facial recognition technology and AI-driven policing. And in 2023, China began construction on a deep-water port in La Guaira, just 20 miles from Caracas, a facility that could easily be converted into a naval base. For Russia and China, Venezuela is a strategic anchor in the Western Hemisphere. It gives them a platform to project power into the Caribbean, threaten U.S. supply chains, and most importantly, force the U.S. to divide its attention between multiple theaters. If the U.S. is bogged down in Venezuela, it has fewer resources to counter China in the South China Sea or Russia in Ukraine. 3. The geopolitical. The U.S. can't afford to lose Latin America. Here's the hard: the U.S. is losing its grip on Latin America. Since 2019, the region has seen a wave of leftist governments come to power: Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, Chile, Honduras. Many of these governments are openly hostile to U.S. influence. And they're increasingly turning to China and Russia for trade, investment, and security partnerships. For the U.S., this is a nightmare scenario. Latin America isn't just America's backyard, it's the soft underbelly of U.S. security. If China and Russia can establish a permanent military presence in Venezuela, they threaten the AMA Canal, the most critical choke point in global trade. Disrupt U.S. energy supplies, since much of America's oil and gas comes from the Gulf of Mexico. Create a second front in any future conflict with China, forcing the U.S. to fight a two-ocean war. The U.S. can't allow that to happen. And that's why the naval deployment isn't just about Venezuela. It's about sending a message to the entire "we're back, and we're not leaving." The exited geopolitical, the new Cold War, and the battle for the Western Hemisphere. To fully grasp what's happening here, you have to out. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the global struggle for supremacy between the US, China, and Russia, a struggle that's entering its most dangerous phase yet. 1. The unipolar moment is over. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption of unipolarity, the idea that it's the world's sole superpower, with no real rivals. But that era is ending. China is now a peer competitor in economic and military terms. Russia, though weakened by its war in Ukraine, remains a nuclear superpower with the ability to project power globally. And the rest of the world is hedging its bets, refusing to pick sides in the new Cold War. The U.S. response to this shift has been liberal hegemony, the belief that America can shape the world in its image through military force, economic coercion, and regime change. But liberal hegemony is failing. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, these weren't just tactical mistakes. They were strategic disasters that eroded U.S. credibility and emboldened its rivals. Now, the U.S. is facing a multipolar world, where power is diffused among multiple centers. And in this world, the rules of the game have changed. The U.S. can no longer dictate outcomes. It has to compete, and that competition is playing out in places like Venezuela. 2. The Monroe Doctrine 2.0, America's sphere of influence under threat. The Monroe Doctrine, the 19th century policy that declared Latin America off-limits to European powers, has been the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere for over 200 years. But in the 21st century, the Monroe Doctrine is being challenged like never before. China and Russia aren't just economic partners to Latin American countries. They're security partners. And they're offering something the U.S. can't: non-interference. Unlike the U.S., which demands political and economic reforms in exchange for aid, China and Russia don't care about human rights or democracy. They just want access to resources and markets. This is why countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba are turning to them. And it's why the U.S. is so desperate to reassert control. If it loses Latin America, it loses its strategic depth, the ability to project power globally without fear of being outflanked. 3. The Cuban Missile Crisis: how close are we to war? The last time the US faced a direct military challenge in its hemisphere was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Back then, the Soviet Union tried to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The US responded with a naval blockade, and the world came within a hair's breadth of nuclear war. Today, the situation is eerily similar. Russia isn't placing nukes in Venezuela, but it is deploying strategic bombers and advanced air defenses. China isn't building missile silos, but it is constructing a deep-water port that could host its navy. And the US is responding with a carrier strike group, the same tool it used in 1962. The difference? In 1962, both sides had clear red lines. Today, those lines are blurred. The US doesn't know how far Russia and China are willing to go. Russia and China don't know how far the US is willing to go. And in that uncertainty lies the greatest risk of miscalculation. Military and strategic, the risks of a limited strike. Let's talk about what a US strike on Venezuela would actually look like and why it's far riskier than the hawks in Washington want to admit. 1. The target: what the US would hit. If the US were to launch a limited strike against Venezuela, the most likely targets would Russian and Iranian military assets, the airbase at Nicosia, the port of La Guaira, and any known Quds Force or Wagner Group facilities. Venezuela's air defenses, the S-300VM systems Russia has deployed, which could shoot down US aircraft. Gold and oil infrastructure, the Orinoco Belt's gold mines and the state-owned PDVSA oil facilities, to cripple Venezuela's economy. Command and control, military headquarters in Caracas, Maracaibo, and Valencia, to decapitate Venezuela's leadership. The goal wouldn't be regime change, not yet. It would be deterrence, a demonstration that the US can and will strike if Venezuela continues to host foreign military assets. 2. The escalation: how far would Russia and China go? Here's where it gets dangerous. Russia and China have both stated that an attack on Venezuela would be considered an attack on their interests. But what does that mean in practice? Russia, Moscow, has already shown it's willing to escalate in Ukraine. Would it send more bombers to Venezuela? Deploy Wagner Group mercenaries? Launch cyber attacks on US infrastructure? The answer is probably yes, but how far it's willing to go is unclear. China, Beijing, is more cautious, but it's also more invested in Venezuela. Would it send naval assets to the Caribbean? Impose economic sanctions on the US? The answer is possibly, but China's response would likely be asymmetric, targeting US supply chains or financial markets. The biggest risk? Miscalculation. If the US strikes a Russian or Chinese asset by accident, the response could spiral out of control. And in a world with 3 nuclear powers, that's a risk no one can afford. 3. The lessons of Iraq, Afghanistan, and why limited strikes rarely stay limited. The US has a long history of launching limited strikes that escalate into full-blown wars. Iraq, Afghanistan are the cautionary tales that should give any serious strategist pause. But here's the uncomfortable: the US foreign policy establishment has never truly internalized these lessons. Instead, it operates on a kind of institutional muscle memory, where the default response to any perceived threat is a display of kinetic force, followed by the assumption that the adversary will simply fold. That's not strategy, that's wishful thinking with bombs. Let me explain why this matters in the case of Venezuela. When I look at the potential targets I listed earlier, Russian S-300s, Iranian Quds Force outposts, PDVSA refineries, I don't just see military assets. I see tripwires. Each one is a potential escalation point, not just with Venezuela, but with the great powers backing it. And here's what most people don't: the US military is not actually designed for this kind of calibrated, limited warfare against a peer competitor. It's designed for overwhelming dominance in asymmetric conflicts, where the enemy can't shoot back effectively. But Venezuela in 2024 is not Iraq in 2003. It's a proxy battleground where the rules of engagement are written by Moscow and Beijing, not Washington. Take the S-300VM systems, for example. These aren't just any air defenses, they're the same systems Russia has deployed in Syria and Kaliningrad, specifically to complicate US air operations. If the US were to strike them, it wouldn't just be a technical challenge, it would be a political one. Russia has already warned that any attack on its military personnel or equipment in Venezuela would be met with a proportional response. Now, what does that mean in practice? It could mean anything from cyber attacks on U.S. power grids to airstrikes on U.S. bases in Colombia or Guyana. Or it could mean something far more: a direct confrontation in a theater where the U.S. has no clear escalation dominance. Here's where the historical parallels become instructive. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and the Soviet Union found themselves in a standoff over nuclear missiles just 90 miles off the Florida coast. The world held its breath as Kennedy and Khrushchev played a game of chicken with the fate of humanity. But there's a key difference between then and in 1962. Both sides had a clear understanding of the stakes. They had back channels, they had diplomatic off-ramps, and most importantly, they had a shared interest in avoiding mutual annihilation. Today, the US is dealing with a Russia that is far more unpredictable and a China that is far more assertive. Neither Moscow nor Beijing has any incentive to back down if they believe their core interests are at stake. Now, let's talk about the military implications. If the US were to launch a strike on Venezuela, it would likely do so using a combination of stealth aircraft, cruise missiles, and possibly even hypersonic weapons. The goal would be to minimize U.S. casualties while maximizing the shock value of the attack. But here's the: Venezuela's air defenses, while not as sophisticated as Russia's, are still formidable enough to force the U.S. to commit significant resources to suppress them. And that's before we even consider the possibility of Russian or Iranian personnel being caught in the crossfire. Let me give you a concrete example. In 2018, the U.S. launched airstrikes on Syria in response to a chemical weapons attack. The operation was hailed as a success until it was revealed that Russian air defenses had shot down a number of U.S. missiles, and that Russian electronic warfare systems had significantly degraded the effectiveness of the strike. Now, imagine a similar scenario in Venezuela, but with the added complication of Russian and Iranian personnel on the ground, potentially operating those very same air defenses. The risk of miscalculation is not just theoretical, it's baked into the operational reality of the situation. And then there's the question of what comes in. The US has a long history of assuming that a limited strike will be enough to force an adversary to back down. But in Venezuela, that assumption is dangerously flawed. Maduro's regime is not just a client state, it's a survivalist regime that has already weathered years of economic collapse, mass protests, and even a failed coup attempt. A U.S. strike might rally the population around the flag, but it could also push Maduro into a corner where he feels he has no choice but to escalate. And that's where things get really dangerous. Here's: Venezuela is not just a military problem, it's a geopolitical one. The country sits at the intersection of multiple great power rivalries, and any U.S. action there will be interpreted through the lens of those rivalries. For Russia, Venezuela is a way to project power into the Western Hemisphere and force the U.S. to divert resources away from Ukraine. For China, it's a critical source of oil and a testing ground for its own military and economic influence. For Iran, it's a foothold in the Americas and a way to bleed the U.S. in its own backyard. If the U.S. strikes Venezuela, it won't just be hitting Maduro, it will be hitting the interests of three of its most formidable adversaries. So what's the alternative? That's the question no one in Washington seems willing to ask. The establishment narrative is that the U.S. must do something to counter Russian and Iranian influence in Venezuela, but the reality is that there are no good options, only less bad ones. A limited strike might satisfy the urge to do something, but it could also trigger a chain reaction that spirals out of control. Economic pressure might work, but it could also push Venezuela even further into the arms of Russia and China. Diplomacy might be the best option, but it's also the least likely to succeed in a world where great powers are increasingly willing to use force to achieve their objectives. Let me be: I'm not saying the US should do nothing. But I am saying that any action must be carefully calibrated to avoid unintended consequences. And that's where the US foreign policy establishment has repeatedly failed. It's not enough to have the most powerful military in the world, you also need a strategy that accounts for the fact that your adversaries are not just weaker versions of yourself. They have their own goals, their own capabilities, and their own red lines. And in the case of Venezuela, those red lines are drawn in bright, unmistakable colors. The bottom line is: a U.S. strike on Venezuela would not be a surgical operation. It would be the opening move in a much larger game, one where the stakes are higher, the players are more dangerous, and the risks of miscalculation are greater than anything we've seen in decades. And that's a game the US cannot afford to lose. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy dilemma, it's a domestic political minefield. The Biden administration, like every administration before it, is caught between the rock of geopolitical reality and the hard place of American public opinion. And in an election year, that pressure cooker becomes even more volatile. Let me explain why this matters. First, there's the question of credibility. The US has spent the better part of 2 decades oscillating between intervention and disengagement in Latin America, and the results have been, to put it charitably, mixed. The 2002 coup attempt against Hugo Chavez, widely believed to have had at least tacit US support, failed spectacularly, leaving Washington looking both reckless and ineffective. Fast forward to 2019, when the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president, only to watch his parallel government collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Now, in 2024, the US is back to square sanctioning Maduro's regime, supporting opposition figures, and quietly negotiating with the same officials it once labeled as narco-terrorists. The message to the American public? That US policy in Venezuela is reactive, inconsistent, and ultimately hollow. Here's the uncomfortable: the establishment narrative that the US must stand up to dictators and defend democracy isn't just simplistic, it's politically convenient. It allows policymakers to frame every crisis as a moral binary, where the US is either the hero or the villain, with no room for nuance. But the reality is that Venezuela's crisis is not a morality play. It's a geopolitical chess match, and the American people are being asked to foot the bill for moves they don't fully understand. Take the recent sanctions relief, for example. In October 2023, the Biden administration eased some of the most punishing economic restrictions on Venezuela in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free and fair elections. The move was met with howls of protest from both sides of the aisle. Republicans accused the White House of appeasing a dictator, while progressives argued that sanctions relief would only enrich Maduro's cronies without delivering real change. Both critiques had merit, but neither acknowledged the bigger that the US was trying to thread a needle it had already broken. The problem is that sanctions, like military strikes, are a blunt instrument. They don't just target the regime, they strangle the economy, deepen poverty, and push ordinary Venezuelans into the arms of the very actors the US is trying to counter. According to the UN, US sanctions have contributed to a 76% drop in Venezuela's GDP since 2014. A collapse that has forced nearly 8 million people to flee the country. That's not just a humanitarian crisis, it's a strategic one. Every Venezuelan who crosses the border into Colombia or Brazil becomes a potential recruit for criminal gangs, a drain on regional resources, or worst of all, a voter in a country where anti-US sentiment is already running high. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election. If you think foreign policy doesn't move the needle in American politics, think again. The last time Venezuela was a major campaign issue was in 2016, when Donald Trump used the country's collapse as a cudgel against Hillary Clinton, framing her as soft on socialism and weak on Latin America. 8 years later, the script hasn't changed much. Trump is already dusting off the same playbook, painting Biden as a feckless leader who let communist dictators run roughshod over the hemisphere. And if Maduro does what he's done before, jail opposition leaders, rig the election, or simply ignore the results, the pressure on Biden to do something will become unbearable. But here's where it gets really tricky. Any US action, whether it's a military strike, a cyber attack, or a new round of sanctions, will be framed by both sides as either a bold stand for democracy or a reckless escalation. The problem is that neither narrative is entirely wrong. A limited strike might satisfy the hawks in Congress, but it could also trigger a regional backlash, with countries like Brazil and Mexico, both led by leftist governments, condemning the US as an imperialist bully. On the other hand, doing nothing risks emboldening Maduro, who has already survived multiple coup attempts, mass protests, and economic meltdowns. The man is a survivor, and he knows that in the game of geopolitical chicken, the US has more to lose than he does. So what's the endgame? Let me offer a scenario that no one in Washington wants to talk. Maduro wins the 2024 election, fairly or not, and the US is forced to recognize his government, not because it wants to, but because the alternatives are worse. It's not hard to imagine. After all, the US has a long history of doing business with dictators when it suits its interests. Augusto Pinochet, Saddam Hussein, and the Saudi royal family all come to mind. The difference is that Maduro isn't just a dictator, he's a dictator with powerful friends. Russia, China, and Iran aren't going to abandon him, and they're not going to let the US dictate the terms of Venezuela's future. That leaves the US with a double down on a failing strategy, or accept that Venezuela is no longer a country it can control. The first option is politically expedient but strategically disastrous. The second is strategically sound but politically toxic. And in an election year, that's a choice no administration wants to make. Here's the thing about it: doesn't care about your election cycle. The world keeps turning, alliances keep shifting, and the crises keep coming. The question for the US isn't whether it can afford to act in Venezuela, it's whether it can afford not to. And if the past 2 decades have taught us anything, it's that the answer to that question is almost always the no. But that doesn't mean the US should act recklessly. It means it should act wisely, or not at all. The problem is that wisdom and Washington rarely go hand in hand. And in Venezuela, that's a recipe for disaster. Now, what most people don't realize is that the US Navy's movements in the Caribbean over the past 18 months haven't been random. They've been deliberate, calculated, and most importantly, deniable. Take the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group's deployment to the Eastern Pacific in late 2023. Officially, it was a routine exercise. Unofficially, it was a message to Beijing that the US could project power within striking distance of the AMA Canal, a choke point Venezuela's oil exports depend on. Then there was the USS Herschel Woody Williams, an expeditionary mobile base ship, which parked itself off Curaçao for weeks last spring under the guise of humanitarian preparedness. The Venezuelan military noticed. The Russians noticed. And if you were paying attention to the pattern of US naval rotations, you'd have noticed too. Here's the uncomfortable: the Biden administration has been running a shadow campaign against Maduro, one that doesn't rely on overt regime change operations or clumsy coup plots. Instead, it's a strategy of containment by proxy, leveraging naval power to box Venezuela into a corner without firing a shot. The goal isn't to topple Maduro, at least, not yet. It's to make his survival so costly that he either negotiates on US terms or collapses under the weight of his own contradictions. The problem? Maduro isn't playing by the old rules. He's not Saddam Hussein in 1991, isolated and vulnerable. He's more like Bashar al-Assad in 2015, backed by external patrons, willing to endure economic strangulation, and convinced that time is on his side. Let me explain why this matters. The US has historically relied on 3 tools to shape outcomes in its near-economic sanctions: covert action and military coercion. In Venezuela, all 3 have failed. Sanctions have impoverished the population without breaking the regime. Covert action, like the 2020 Bay of Piglets fiasco involving Silvercorp USA, has been amateurish and counterproductive. And military coercion? Well, that's where the Navy comes in. But here's the US can't credibly threaten an invasion. Not with China and Russia watching, not with the American public still scarred by Iraq, and not when the Pentagon's own wargames suggest a Venezuelan campaign would be a quagmire. So what's left? The answer lies in what I call strategic ambiguity with teeth. The US isn't going to invade, but it's going to make sure Maduro knows it could. It's not going to recognize his 2024 election, but it's going to leave the door open for back-channel talks. It's not going to cut off all oil exports, but it's going to make sure every barrel that leaves Venezuela's shores is tracked, taxed, and if necessary, interdicted. This is the new face of US power projection in the 21st: not boots on the ground, but ships on the horizon, drones in the sky, and cyber tools in the shadows. Now, let's talk about the alternatives. The first is the one: the establishment double down on the status quo. Keep the sanctions, keep the diplomatic pressure, keep the occasional naval exercise, and hope that Maduro either cracks or is overthrown by his own generals. The problem with this approach is that it assumes Maduro is a rational actor who responds to pressure. He's not. He's a survivalist who has outlasted every prediction of his demise. The second alternative is the one the realists recognize: that Venezuela is a lost cause and pivot to damage control. This means reopening diplomatic channels, easing sanctions in exchange for concessions, and treating Maduro like the leader of a sovereign state even if he's a thug. The downside? It rewards bad behavior and sends a message to other dictators that the US can be worn down. Then there's the third option, the one no one in Washington wants to admit is only a limited, surgical intervention to degrade Venezuela's military capabilities and force Maduro to the negotiating table. I'm not talking about an Iraq-style invasion. I'm talking about a targeted campaign at cyber attacks on the state oil company PDVSA, drone strikes on key military installations, or even a naval blockade to strangle Venezuela's economy. The risks are it could trigger a regional war, it could backfire spectacularly, and it could hand Maduro a propaganda victory. But the upside? It might actually work. Here's the thing about grand: it's not about what you want to happen. It's about what you're willing to do to make it happen. The US has spent the last 2 decades learning the hard way that military power alone can't solve political problems. But it's also learned that doing nothing has consequences. In Venezuela, those consequences are already playing out. The country is a narco-state in all but name, with the military deeply involved in cocaine trafficking. It's a haven for Russian mercenaries and Iranian proxies. And it's a staging ground for Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. The longer the US dithers, the worse these problems get. So where does that leave us? With a choice between bad options and worse ones. The Biden administration has tried to thread the needle, but it's running out of time. The 2024 election is looming, and Venezuela isn't going to wait for November. Maduro is already preparing for a post-US world, one where Venezuela is a client state of Beijing and Moscow. The question for Washington isn't whether it can afford to act. It's whether it can afford the cost of inaction. Let me leave you with this. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US Navy blockaded Cuba not because it wanted war, but because it wanted to force the Soviets to blink. The blockade worked because it was credible, because it was proportional, and because it left room for diplomacy. Today, the US is trying to do something similar in Venezuela, but with one critical: the enemy isn't a superpower. It's a failing state with powerful friends. That changes the calculus. A blockade of Venezuela wouldn't just be a signal to Maduro. It would be a signal to Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And that's a game the US can't afford to lose. The hidden US Navy response to Venezuela isn't about ships or missiles. It's about sending the era of American retreat is over. The question is whether anyone in Caracas or Beijing or Moscow is listening.